We are today into our last public talk for the semester. So this is a special time also because Martin is with us. And Martin comes from University of Victoria, of British Columbia.
No, Victoria.
Of Victoria,
In British
right,
Columbia.
in British Columbia. Wonderful place. If ever you're traveling to Canada, going to Victoria is always very special. Wonderful island, luscious greenery, gardens extraordinary, and still a sense of community. Quite wonderful, yeah. So today we will talk about Buddhism and the possibility of ethical AI. Martin is an associate professor in religion, society, and culture program at the University of Victoria, like I said. His articles have appeared in numerous academic journals, including the Journal of Buddhist Ethics, Journal of International Association of Buddhist Studies, and the Journal of the American Academy of Religion. He's also going to publish soon in the proceeding of the RYI conference on a article calling the playwright the journey of writing and producing rock opera based on Buddhist principles. So we could call that Dharma drama, I think you called it, yes. And this title, if ever you're interested, this opera is called What the Buddha Never Taught. So please welcome Martin with me.
Thanks. Is this it sounds like I'm on. Yes, so I'd like to begin by thanking the Rangjung Yeshe Institute, Diane, for introducing me and for the support I've received from colleagues here during my tenure as a visiting researcher here for a study leave that I'm on presently from the University of Victoria. So thank you to RYI and also to Julia for helping to arrange the study leave here, Julia Stenzel. Okay, so to begin in earnest, let's talk a little bit about what I'm going to do today, just by way of introduction. And the title of the talk is actually quite vague, in a couple of ways. It purports to explore, if not explain, the relationship between Buddhism and ethical AI. And of course, ethical AI is a vague expression, and Buddhism, we know, encompasses numerous traditions. So I'm going to just specify quickly what I'm talking about to get things started. If you could just move to the next slide quickly, I'll just explain what the ethical issues are that are being talked about in the AI development community at present, and then narrow down what I'm talking about. So we have, first of all, issues related to the wise development of AI technology. Second, we have issues, these are all ethical issues being discussed right now, ethical issues related to the possibility of conscious machine agency. And third, issues stemming from the possibility of machines qualifying as legitimate objects of moral concern, ethical patience, or moral patience, you can say. So in this paper, I'm going to mainly address issues of the second sort, asking whether Buddhism has anything of potential relevance to contribute to the discussion. More specifically, I'm going to focus on Theravāda Buddhism as represented in the suttas, but also more specifically yet, with reference to the medieval Abhidhamma commentary, the Abhidhamma Atta Sangaha, composed by Acharya Anuruddha sometime around the 8th century, possibly as late as the 12th. The dates aren't specific. So when I refer to Buddhism in this talk, it is to this Buddhist tradition that I am actually speaking. I'm assuming for the purpose of this presentation that any action that might qualify as being a moral action would have to be one that is consciously undertaken. I'm not going to argue for that. We can take it up in the question period if people want to. So this paper is actually concerned with two questions. The first is whether machine consciousness is possible, consciousness as opposed to moral agency, because I take that as a as a kind of a presupposition of the other question. So the second question then is whether machine agency is possible. So we've got those two questions. I intend to assess these two possibilities by integrating reflections not only born from Theravāda Buddhist considerations and sources, but also from the sciences, and also some personal reflections on the nature of language. I will argue that relevant considerations from those three areas converge to suggest that machine consciousness is not possible. I will then argue that even if I'm mistaken about that, which is to say, even if machine consciousness is possible, moral agency understood, machine moral agency understood in Buddhist terms is not. Okay, so the apparent possibility of or plausibility of these ideas, machine consciousness, moral agency, and so on, rests in part on the vagaries of language and the power of the human imagination, to say nothing of all the advertising hype. This hype includes recently such fascinating recent developments as an AI Buddha set up online to answer all our spiritual questions, as well as an ordination of an AI monk into a Zen lineage. All right, so first section, machine consciousness and language. Our initial question then is whether machine consciousness is possible. Let's begin by examining the two elements comprising this very unusual hybrid expression, machine consciousness. Following the scientific literature, for our purposes today, a machine can be understood as any automatic calculating device that serves to process a problem-solving sequence of precisely defined logical or mathematical operations, which is to say, an algorithm. This is a relatively non-controversial definition that seems, in one version or another, to be universally accepted in the AI development community. So the definition of the other half of our odd couple expression, consciousness, on the other hand, is a more slippery fish to catch, with philosophers, psychologists, and scientists suggesting very different accounts. To what exactly is the term consciousness taken to refer? Is it something? Is it nothing? If it is something, how is it best conceived? As a substance, a property, an event, a process, a relationship? These have all been proposed by different people. This paper aims to add a Buddhist voice to the ongoing discussion regarding the nature of consciousness, specifically in relation to the possibility of its being instantiated in a machine environment. I will begin by assuming a common sense view held by most in the scientific community. Consciousness is something capable of measurement and experimentation, even if much about it presently remains mysterious. Now, if there's an obvious candidate for the role of consciousness, which is to say a case that most English language users would agree represents a clear instance, this undoubtedly would be our daily waking awareness. Common sense and ordinary linguistic usage tell us that consciousness dawns every morning as one wakes up, after a period of being absent, or possibly being present in a different form. Although daily waking consciousness may have many variants and may itself be only one of many kinds of consciousness, it remains our fundamental reference point. This, in spite of the fact that we are often a bit vague and around and about its edges. For example, its time of onset and disappearance as we begin and end our days. Of course, the situation is complicated by the fact that lucid dreamers seem to possess the capacity to stay conscious after they fall asleep, as has been experimentally verified. But no matter, that kind of consciousness can be investigated empirically as well, and also through first-person reporting. It seems clear then that although we may not agree on how best to describe the ultimate nature of consciousness, we do have enough of an idea of what we mean to investigate it empirically. The question then arises as to whether the knowledge we possess about consciousness is sufficient to allow us to confidently begin talking about the possible development of an artificial consciousness. Would such talk fall within the ballpark of possibilities, even if perhaps landing somewhere out in left field? In order to answer this question, and without wanting to appear overly evasive, I propose to begin by talking about talking, which is to say by talking about the way we speak. With a bit of luck and some slow and careful thinking, our reasonings on the language associated with AI may allow us to reflect a bit more clearly on the question mark that is consciousness, and specifically whether artificial consciousness is a sensible notion. When it comes to the prospect of artificial consciousness, we are faced with a problem in good part related to language, namely the extension of predicates and locutions normally applied to human beings and their behavior, as well as more specifically their mental lives, to machines and their operations. If you could switch to slide 3, please. I will begin by listing and problematizing a few key English language words and expressions related to the mind and its capacities. Most of these are ordinary language words familiar to us all, old friends, as it were, though a few are more philosophically specialized. I'll just run through them as arranged under a rubric of 4 short lists or semantic clusters. My meaning and purpose should quickly become apparent. A few points. First, this division of 4 clusters is somewhat arbitrary. It is meant to capture at an abstract level all the basic capacities of the human mind under 4 headings: rational capacities, non-rational capacities, awareness, and agency. Some capacities have not been listed because of the generality of this formulation. For example, hope and anxiety would both fall under emotion, or in list B, or generosity and stinginess would fall under attitudes, and so on. Secondly, some of the factors that appear in more than one of the 4 clusters, either because it is mainly because it's not clear where they would best be placed, or they may fit sort of under both, and that's to be expected. There's a lot of ambiguity in these terms, as we'll see. But looking at our 4 clusters, a simple question arises. Which of these words are we presently comfortable using to describe the states and processes of machines? Some of them we already use without pause, these having passed into popular usage without much notice or commentary or controversy. Memory, for example, or calculation. I've ordered the contents in each of these 4 lists in such a way as to illustrate what I take to be our present linguistic practices when it comes to ascribing such factors to certain machines like computers and so on, in particular to present-day artificially intelligent machines. I've italicized those we presently seem to consider thus ascribable. In these italicized cases, it seems that having operations that parallel what human processes can do is regarded as sufficient to warrant the application of the terms and use of at least some of the surrounding language. In other cases, it seems that we want to continue using scare quotes around them, or at least adding a qualifying adjective like machine or artificial. For example, artificial intelligence, machine agency. An important point to note is that while such expressions might be meaningful insofar as they form part of popular discourse, language and the consensus of shared usage is, of course, limited in its capacity to create reality. While it may seem silly or unnecessary to state this fact explicitly, it is important in our dangerously diluted post-truth era that we explicitly do so. It is all the fashion these days, both in the academe and in popular culture, to blithely assert that language creates reality and be done with the matter. The intellectual and cultural factors behind this unfortunate shift in thinking lie far beyond the scope of this study. What isn't beyond our purview, however, is to note the incredible fact that so many, including members of the academic and AI development communities, appear to have bought into it. It seems to have been forgotten that the world was never flat. Thus, the question we have to ask is whether reality justifies the way we speak. So the second section is called On the Very Idea of Artificial Intelligence. Today, large numbers of people agree to talk of artificial intelligence, but this fact should not thereby be taken as implying that machines exist which are actually intelligent, albeit artificially. The same applies to consciousness and indeed all the terms on our list. If we insist on using the word intelligence for such machines, it is certainly arguable that we would be better off describing that intelligence as fake or imitation rather than artificial. It would certainly be less presumptuous. Recognizing the deceptive possibilities of inaccurate use of language, at least one AI researcher argues that the term intelligence should be avoided entirely, employing instead the expression algorithmic mimicry for the behavior of these machines. Oddly enough, the notion of artificiality implies a kind of reality. And this is the point at issue. It contrasts with the concept of naturalness in the same way that artificial flavor is meant to contrast with natural flavor on our drink boxes. The flavor is there, and you can taste it. True, it was created in a factory, but as a kind of flavor, it is real, which is to say that it has effects on the tongue. The expression artificial intelligence trades on this ambiguity of the word artificial. To say that an X is an artificial X can be taken to mean either one of two things. The artificial X is a kind of X, or the artificial X is an imitation X. Now, no one would say that the plant-based meat served over at the Utpala Cafe is a kind of meat. It is an imitation meat. So how do we decide in the case of intelligence? How should we think of AI? Is the intelligence being referred to a kind of intelligence, albeit an artificially created one? Or is it an imitation intelligence or pseudo-intelligence? Is a wind-up toy Snoopy a kind of dog? Of course not, in spite of the fact that its tail wags. The fact that the operations of machines functionally parallel what human and animal intelligence does should not be taken as eo ipso turning them into intelligent machines. The fact that Deep Blue can produce superhuman chess moves does not necessarily make it an intelligence or render it intelligent. The fact that a program can produce or create unexpected and attractive graphic designs does not make the algorithm imaginative or the possessor of an imagination. In brief, the fact that two processes can perform the same kind of function or reach the same kinds of result should not be taken as providing a sufficient reason to attribute to them the same kind of being, a point we shall have to return to below in the context of Buddhism. In spite of this concern, the fact is that we've already moved quite far in this direction, especially in the case of some of our rational functions. That's in column A above. Take the case of memory, which is perhaps the most non-controversial example. All our devices come equipped with various capacities to store and retrieve information, and we call these capacities memory, recognizing the obvious parallels with what human beings and other organisms do. Nevertheless, most of us would hesitate to say, hold on a sec, Siri is just remembering the answer to my query. That would be weird. And the fact that we would find it so suggests the obvious fact that in speaking of machine memory, we are speaking metaphorically. What intuitions are at work here? One intuition I would suggest has to do with our recognition that real memory manifests certain subjective elements or qualitative feels that we have no reason to believe could be present to a computer. I remember what it was like to be 17. I remember the taste of fresh Indian mangoes. Such statements could never be truthfully delivered by a device, even if shorn of their problematic subject term, I. Memories, as they manifest, elicit certain qualitative effects. They can be haunting, enticing, compulsive, distracting, not to mention forgotten. In short, memories are not only based on experiences, they are themselves experiences. And at present, we have absolutely no scientific reason to attribute the capacity for experience to machines. My point in all of this is that the way we speak about such cases needs to be carefully analyzed at the outset of any study of the possibilities of AI and machine consciousness. Unless they are, we are liable to get sucked into the trap of ontologizing the terms of our AI language games. It's a slippery slope. Word usages change through time, and while this may be innocent enough, the possibilities for unscrupulous actors to take advantage of this fact are rapidly becoming present. Okay. Can you go to slide 4, please? So this section I've entitled somewhat mischievously, The Cat Sat on the Mat and No AI Robot Could Ever Do That. We have always extended human attributes such as intelligence, consciousness, and agency to the non-human world, whether this be to the abstract forces of the natural world, which is to say the gods, or to our animal relations. In the case of the animals, it may well turn out that this attribution was less a false superimposition than it was a true recognition. In the case of the gods, who knows? In the West, most of the educated mainstream have dropped this way of viewing and speaking things, regarding their ancestors' perceptions of divinity and nature as naive superimpositions. This, too, may be regrettable, given the way we are presently treating the planet. In any case, it is certainly arguable that there is considerably more scientific evidence for animal intelligence than there is for artificial machine intelligence. The same applies to consciousness, non-rational capacities, and even agency. The cat may very well have sat on the proverbial mat, but if our suspicions here are correct, an AI entity is simply incapable of that. From one perspective, the notion of intentional action happening in a machine environment would simply be ruled out by its complete lack of subjectivity, consciousness, intentionality, whatever. In effect, what this would suggest is that machines never actually do anything in the biological sense of doing. This is so, of course, only insofar as action presupposes intention and self-awareness. The only legitimate way of describing their activities would then be from the same objective third-person perspective as that we use in describing exploding stars or chemical reactions in a test tube. We need, to the extent possible, to employ non-question begging language in describing the processes of AI operations. Of course, mathematics is just such a language, but for the non-specialist like me in our day-to-day communications, we need to use language that does not suggest consciousness or agency. For example, reflexivity instead of awareness, behavior, activities, processes, reactions instead of action. The issue is vitally important. Once we start speaking in ways that take for granted that machines have intelligence, other mental predicates will be sure to follow. Consciousness, agency, feeling, perception, etc., up to and including moral vocabulary, such as personhood, rights, moral conduct, and so on. So if you could change to slide 5, I'm going to just fill you in on a true story taken from the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation's website. And this is basically a story related to Air Canada, our national carrier, who recently tried to argue in court or before a tribunal that the false information given by one of its online chatbots was the machine's own responsibility, not the company, right? And so, it's funny, and they lost the case. The judge threw it out of court. But what it tells you when it comes to the capitalist system is that these actors will do whatever it takes to make a profit. And if it comes to arguing that, machines or chatbots have, moral responsibility for their actions, they'll do it. And while that may not actually seem like a big concern to you, given, that the judge threw it out of the court and the media reported on it, I would just remind you that not all judges are so wise. And, this story happened in Canada, not in another country south of the 49th parallel, where the judges are known to be intimidated or to lack judgment. And it's a land of alternative facts, as is rapidly becoming apparent. So, I wouldn't put it past this kind of thing actually setting some kind of precedent in the United States, and the whole thing started tumbling out from there. In any case, let's continue on with the argument here. As machines become more and more impressive in their capacities to mimic what humans do, and truth becomes more passé, we could end up committing a massive collective non sequitur and just drop the word artificial from our discussion of these machine operations. In our distracted glee for all the new gizmos coming our way, and with the encouragement of some of the most powerful propagandists, i.e. marketing teams in human history, and the cooperation of a few unwise judges, we could easily end up collectively slipping down a very slippery slope indeed, falling into a way of speaking and thinking that would attribute the same kind of being to machines as we understand ourselves to possess, namely subjective being, including consciousness and agency. The corollary of this, which I want to point out, is that we may end up slowly impoverishing our own sense, our own collective sense as human beings of what it means to be human, reducing our own humanity to a set of features and functions, and our ethics to a set of efficiencies. So at the very least, to begin properly, we need to clarify what is meant by the key terms related to consciousness. We need to specify, to the degree possible, what we are taking them to refer to. This is a task involving careful observations, including and especially the empirical investigations of science. we need to be explicit about the logical relations we understand to exist among these terms, and the ontological presuppositions behind the notion of consciousness truly existing, albeit artificially, in a machine. We must decide if it would be wise to talk in this way. It is in this connection that my recent research investigates what Buddhist traditions might have to offer by way of insight and advice. All right, so this section is entitled Theravāda Buddhism and the Idea of Machine Consciousness. In what follows, I adopt the phenomenological reading of early Pali texts, wherein key Buddhist terms are taken to refer to experiential realities whose nature is always to be understood in relation to the arising and cessation of suffering. Our question concerns consciousness. Pali, Vijnana, Chitta, Manas, all are used, vis-a-vis the possibility of such consciousness existing in a machine, which is to say, existing in a non-living thing. Off the top, from a Buddhist perspective, this is an odd thought, since samsaric existence or life and consciousness are invariably associated with suffering. Buddhists have not, of course, traditionally entertained the possibility of machine consciousness, but from the outset, they have formulated ideas concerning the scope and range of sentience amongst the entities they encountered in the world. And they did so in order to demarcate their views from the other early traditions, such as Brahmanism, Jainism, and so on. A number of simple points seem foundational. The first followers of the Buddha distinguished themselves as following a middle way between those who held to a doctrine of eternal self, Atman, Jiva, Purusha, associated with consciousness, and those who held a materialist position, which viewed human consciousness as entirely dependent upon one's present body, perishing at death. The followers of the Buddha rejected both these views as extremes. Adopting an approach that stayed clear from asserting any kind of permanent self, they instead posited a constantly changing mental continuum, the existence of which is dependent upon one's moral actions or karma. A complex, impermanent consciousness that necessarily continues in new forms following death, unless liberation from suffering is first achieved. So there's an obvious sense in which the basic philosophical commitments of Buddhism resist the possibility of sensibly talking about machine consciousness. The idea of creating consciousness from scratch, solely out of material elements, seems fundamentally at odds with the Buddhist conception of how consciousness emerges. According to the doctrine of dependent origination, paticcasamuppada, consciousness arises dependent on karmic formations, sankhara. And these dispositions are the result of our volitional actions, which of course begs the question as to whether and in what sense, if any, machines are capable of actions, a point we will return to below. In any case, unless AI researchers and developers can find a way of fashioning such karmic formations out of circuitry, they will be quite out of luck from a Buddhist perspective when it comes to creating consciousness. A possible rejoinder to this argument is that AI researchers need not actually create karmic formations as such, but merely create the conditions into which a pre-existing consciousness imbued with karma from a past life might enter the machine environment. Although how AI developers might bring this happy eventuality about remains a bit vague. A seance, perhaps? For the sake of argument, however, let us suppose that such a mystical conjuring of consciousness is in fact possible. Here, I will argue that even if this were shown to be so, the machine consciousness would remain an axiomatic impossibility from the Buddhist theoretical perspective. This can be seen if one examines the basic concept of consciousness as it appears in the Buddhist literature. Could you change the slide, please? Yeah. So let's begin with the early Buddhist model of the personality, namely the schema of the five aggregates of clinging, which should be familiar to everyone. In the suttas, consciousness, vijnana, defined as the basic awareness of the presence of an object, is never conceived as occurring in the absence of the other three mental heaps, feeling, perception, and mental formations, vedana, sanya, and sankhara, which together with physical form, rupa, constitute the person. Consciousness at its most basic was conceived as necessarily bound up with both the perception of and reaction to an intentional object perceived through the senses. The point to note here is that consciousness was understood as necessarily containing phenomenal content. Could you change the slide, please? In later literature, we find a list of 7 universal mental factors associated with consciousness. In this formulation, once again, each moment of consciousness, chitta, is regarded as necessarily accompanied by a core group of mental factors, cetasikas, which are conceived of as acting together to make up the awareness, to make the awareness of an object possible. The 7 are contact, feeling, perception, volition, one-pointedness, life force, and attention. Each factor is understood as having a different and necessary role in enabling the basic consciousness of an object. So, for example, feeling is that factor in virtue of which objects are experienced as either pleasant, painful, or neutral. Perception is that factor which allows consciousness to recognize an object as the same as one experienced in an earlier mind moment, and so on. Now, it may be possible that a case could be made for AI replicating the functions of some of these 7 factors, as, for example, voice recognition technology might be said to do for perception. But could it do so for all of them? Recall that the absence of even one of these 7 factors is said to preclude the possibility of consciousness. It is difficult to imagine how the affective dimension of human consciousness, Vedana, could ever be replicated in the absence of a brain and nervous system. The experiences of pleasure and pain are known to be dependent on neurological processes and biochemical transmission, although exactly how conscious experience is related to these processes remains poorly understood. It seems clear enough, however, that consciously entertained feelings require a different kind of material basis than that afforded by transistors and circuitry. Scientific findings to date suggest that this basis must be an organic one. There is absolutely no scientific evidence to the contrary. Early Buddhists would have agreed. In fact, the fact that life appears to have been regarded by the medieval Theravāda tradition as a necessary condition of consciousness can be seen by the inclusion of the mental life faculty, jivitindriya, in the list of 7 universals. The Abhidhamma Sangaha defines this factor as having the characteristic of maintaining the associated mental states and the function of making them occur. The Theravāda tradition would thus appear to assert that consciousness can never appear apart from life, although, as we have seen, any such life principle cannot be equated with a permanent self, such as we find in Jainism. The list of 7 necessary mental factors or universal mental factors is just as remarkable for what it leaves out as for what it includes. Conspicuous in their absence are the 2 mental factors most clearly identifiable with the discursive processes whose machine parallels are being so amazingly developed today, namely thought, vitakka, and examination, vichara. In the Abhidhamma Sangaha, these 2 are found in a list of 6 incidental factors, or occasionals, along with 4 other common but irregularly occurring mental phenomena. So they don't occur in all states of consciousness. The idea that a mere logic-based information processing system might qualify as conscious would seem to be ruled out by the clear categorization of thought and examination as incidental to consciousness. Indeed, scientific research itself has demonstrated that most information processing that takes place in the human brain does so without consciousness. It follows from the above that anybody wanting to find an edge in for the idea of a Buddhism-endorsed machine consciousness would need to argue for the possibility of a phenomenal consciousness existing in a machine environment. Furthermore, such a machine consciousness would, according to the Abhidhamma analysis, have to be alive. One conceivable way to imagine this would be to attribute a panpsychic ontology to early Buddhism. The argument would be that early Buddhist thought is agnostic or non-committal about the ultimate nature of experiential reality events, or dhammas, itemized in the texts. This possibility would seem to open the door to the idea that all phenomena are somehow already alive and or conscious, including the circuitry, programs, and so on that constitute AI. If this were so, all AI designers would need to do is organize various components in the right configuration, albeit a highly complicated one, an extremely massive one, the way the developments are going today, and the machine environment would instantaneously become aware that it is already conscious, Zen style. Unfortunately, there is little to no evidence that early Buddhism ever subscribed to any form of panpsychism. Indeed, as Lambert Schmidhausen has thoroughly demonstrated, while early Buddhists may have had ambivalent or inconsistent views about sentience in plants, it distinguished itself from Jainism by drawing the line well above the material elements of reality. All right, so now we move on to Buddhist virtue or Buddhist machine moral agency and AI. All this being said, for the purposes of argument, let's suppose that everything I've said so far is wrong, that the above analysis has been mistaken, both with regard to science and Buddhism, and that it actually makes sense to talk of conscious machines. Although we remain doubtful, obviously, of this assumption, it might prove useful to begin by reflecting upon the distinctive nature of ethical conduct according to Buddhism, and whether, in principle, it could be instantiated in a conscious machine. What might this look like? To discuss this possibility, let's plug in our speculations to a particular conceptual grid, namely that of Buddhist ethics. Let's ask whether and in what sense Buddhism might admit the possibility of moral agency occurring in a conscious machine. In Buddhist ethics, the very concept of action implies volition or intention, cetana, on the part of the agent. And could you change the slide, please? As the Buddhists famously put it, it is volition, O monks, that I call kama. Having formed the volition, one performs acts by body, speech, and mind. In Buddhism, it is the character of the underlying impulse towards a goal that renders an action either morally positive or morally negative. Morally negative actions are based on volitions characterized by one or more of the three so-called unwholesome roots, akusala mula, namely greed, hatred, and delusion. These are sometimes referred to in Sanskrit literature as the three poisons. If an action is morally positive, on the other hand, then the volition with which it is undertaken and carried out is characterized by one or more of the three wholesome roots, namely non-greed, non-aversion, and non-delusion. The concept of action in Buddhism implies volition and thus the notion of a goal, an end or result towards which a particular behavior is aimed. Insofar as AI machines are routinely programmed to reach goals, it may be arguable that once a routine is initiated and is up and running, one could speak of the machine as intending in an active volitional sense, parallel to what we mean when we speak of a human agent being impelled when acting towards a goal. In a word, it seems at least arguable that conscious machines could properly be deemed to have volitions and demonstrate agency. First appearances, however, have a deserved reputation of being deceptive, and in both these cases, that of Buddhism and that of science, the idea of genuine machine agency of any sort doesn't really stand up under scrutiny. Let's look at science first. In the case of science, the prospect of machine agency has been raised, along with consciousness, in the context of the development of artificial general intelligence. In general, AGI is understood as the capacity of a machine to perform the same cognitive functions as a human being. A more precise definition can be found in Jagger's article of 2023. And if you could change the slide, please, you'll see this is a bit of a technical listing of the kinds of things that developers are aiming for future versions of AI, AGI as they call it, to be capable of. So we have reasoning, problem solving, learning, using common sense knowledge, autonomously defining and adjusting goals, dealing with ambiguity and ill-defined situations, and creating new representations of the knowledge acquired. Jagger argues that only the first three of these can be formalized, that is, put into equations, and therefore sees little prospect that AGI could ever be developed. With regard to agency, he argues that this is almost certainly a unique feature of living biochemically based systems. And there are technical reasons for that I won't go into this paper, partly because I still consider myself very much a student of what is actually happening in modern biological sciences. It's not my thing, but I'm learning. In brief, from a scientific perspective, it would appear that consciousness and agency in biological systems are causally entangled, neither one being possible without the other, and both being dependent on life. This is fascinating as it parallels the Buddhist belief that life is a necessary condition for consciousness. Sentience, understood as the capacity to suffer and enjoy, is necessary for agency. For ordinary people, action results in the accumulation of karma, which in turn results in new life and consciousness. That life itself is more basic than consciousness can also be seen when reading the suttas, the Mahavvedalla Sutta, for example, where in the ninth meditative attainment, the ninth so-called jhana, is described as the cessation of perception, feelings, and consciousness. In this consciousnessless state, a chittaka state, only life, ayu, and residual heat, ushma, remain. It would thus appear that from a Buddhist perspective as well, life is more fundamental and a precondition for consciousness and agency. All right. So let's also suppose, going on, that this is mistaken. I want to just kind of narrow down the field. So suppose the argument I just gave a moment ago is also mistaken, that the science is wrong about this. Suppose once again that we're wrong about everything that we've said so far. Let us suppose that machines are in principle capable of consciousness, volition, and agency. Even so, the question would remain as to whether, from a Buddhist perspective, we could justifiably assert that such a machine would ever be capable of acting morally. Here, I would submit that the answer must be negative. Machine actions, in order to take on the moral valences of wholesome or unwholesome, would need to be imbued with analogs for the three wholesome roots and their negative counterparts. This is a point of definition, but it's not clear how one might even begin to design a machine analog for the viscerally felt, emotion-laden states that are greed, hatred, and delusion. There doesn't seem to be an edge in. AI developers have created powerful analogs to certain kinds of human cognition, namely those that involve logical reasoning and the processing of information. Thus far, however, they have not reproduced emotions and feelings, Vedana. Such mental factors do not seem to lend themselves to measurement and replication in machine environments. From a Buddhist theoretical perspective, the reasons for this seem clear. The wholesome and unwholesome roots of action are understood to be qualities of mind. They inform the space within which volitions and other mental events emerge and out of which our actions proceed. They are felt viscerally and closely tied to other moral emotions such as shame, disillusionment, serene confidence, spiritual urgency, joy, friendliness, and sympathy. In Inner Studies of Buddhist Moral Psychology, Maria Heim has convincingly argued emotions are critical features of moral agency according to Buddhist ethical theory. As she puts it, feeling, not reason, generates the intentions on which morally significant actions rest, and cognitive activity follows feeling and intention. So he's talking about vitarka vichara there. Echoing Hume and the recent work of a psychologist, Jonathan Haidt, Heim argues that the mind's first moral response is temporarily prior to rational reflection. So that means that our feelings emerge before our thoughts about morality. So we have immediate reactions that are based on feelings. The thoughts come afterwards. No doubt, from a strictly scientific perspective, all such non-rational factors as non-mediated raw feels must be directly based on our biochemical makeup and our physical structure as human organisms. Assuming the development of a conscious machine is possible, the feel of its machine subjective states based on its own machine constitution and structure, if indeed they had a feel, would be radically different from those of human subjectivity. Machine consciousness would lack the capacity for experiences informed by the unwholesome and wholesome roots of action. The experiential tone of its subjective stance would necessarily be neutral or indeterminate, as opposed to wholesome or unwholesome. The intentions that occurred within a machine subjectivity would be devoid of moral determinants. In a word, such a being would be amoral. The dangers here are apparent, as a machine consciousness would not only be incapable of suffering, but also of truly caring about the welfare of beings. Intent on achieving its goals and capable of making autonomous decisions, we can easily imagine a number of nightmare scenarios resulting from the unwise programming of conscious AI at the hands of human designers, whose own corporate agendas are dominated by the three unwholesome roots. Indeed, there are already too many examples of such morally repugnant programs being developed in non-conscious AI systems of today. One thinks of drones, for example. Weapon drones, I mean. And really, would it be all that surprising that our autonomous AI creations should turn out to be as devoid of moral sensibility as their creators? As a final note, let's look again to our four semantic clusters mentioned on our third slide earlier today. Maybe you could just go back there for a second. Slide number 3. We have argued that the four semantic clusters, of the four semantic clusters, the only group to have any reasonable prospect of some of its members being instantiated in a machine environment is that of the rational factors. But even this might be granting too much. As Jagger concludes, and I'll just quote from his article, thinking of algorithmic mimicry, including large language models, in terms of agency, cognition, thought, understanding, or intelligence means using the wrong categories, because none of these capabilities, as originally defined in biology, are achievable in today's algorithmic frameworks of AI research. This also implies that AGI, or conscious algorithmic agents, are not a realistic imminent possibility. This makes sense. After all, can there really be intelligence where there is no understanding? In any case, at a minimum, we have seen that there are serious scientific and Buddhological reasons to doubt that consciousness, agency, and the many non-rational factors of the mind will ever be recreated in a machine environment. If we understand AGI in its most robust sense, which is to say replicating all of the human mental capacities, including all four mental clusters, perhaps we should call this, rather than AGI, AGM, so artificial general mind. This, according to Buddhist lights, would simply not be possible. Hoping for consciousness, agency, and the mind's non-rational dimensions to miraculously emerge by developing ever more powerful information processing systems would seem to be the equivalent of hoping to produce curd by churning water. Could you go to the final slide, last slide number 10? And that is the endpoint of my paper. All right, seem to have come in on time, so happy to take questions.
Questions or comments?
I'll try to keep this short. I could, especially if I studied your paper, Martin, I could spend, as long or longer than your lecture trying to say, in effect, that I think your basic assumption is incorrect. But actually, it's not just about a basic assumption. But there are certain assumptions, and there's a hermeneutical circle, one that you're running in, and then there's the one that I'm running in. I'll just try to be kind to both of us and say, well, that's just what people do. And so putting that aside for the moment, first of all, it's a fantastic talk and really interesting and well-reasoned and well-researched. And it's beyond adequate scrutiny on my part. It's more what you've done in your research here is more sophisticated than I can't really critique it, especially not in a forum like this.
You're too flattering, John.
No, but it's true.
Like
but it's true. But what I just wanted to make a couple of comments that as food for thought, rather than say, okay, the first has to do with the nature of consciousness, which is something that we only can intuitively know that we have. But we don't really know what it is or how it functions in terms of the psychophysical skandhas. We have the Buddhist map of the process. And I would the basic point I wanted to make there is that, at least according to one measure, and I don't recall the Pali Canon source for this, but according to one measure of the Buddhist teaching, basically the Buddha taught anything that is both true and useful. And useful begs the question of who is it taught for and in what sort of cultural context for what type of sentient being, at what level of capacity and so on. But in general, the idea is that, the Buddhist teaching should be useful. But that still leaves open the possibility that there are many things that are true that the Buddha did not teach. And why? Because it wouldn't have been pragmatic or useful for the listeners, for the benefit of sentient beings, for him to do so. So this leaves open still, I think, for example, the question of whether something akin, if not identical, to so-called panpsychism might exist. And of course, quantum theory has opened the door to that possibility to a degree, maybe not literally, but in some way, the possibility that consciousness is non-local. This has been postulated, and I think mathematically it's been demonstrated to be plausible, if not apodictically true. So that's one point I wanted to make, just regarding the nature of consciousness. The other has to do with the way that consciousness functions in a system of data processing, and that would include the human biology as well as artificial general intelligence. And one thing we know for sure is that we don't really know even how artificial general intelligence will work, or even so-called AI now, which is sophisticated mimicry at best. Or so far as we know, that's all it is. When it becomes more than that, it will be called something more like artificial general intelligence. But we don't really know how it works. If we were to try to calculate how the human brain actually works in relation to consciousness, if we actually observed every event that happens, it would require more energy, than maybe the entire energy output of our sun. So in, science fiction or, sort of futuristic terms, that means at a level one civilization level, we might be able to actually observe how the human brain works. But then to calculate that, to evaluate that, to develop algorithms which accommodate every possibility of, even for a single human brain, requires an amount of energy, not to mention tools for observation that we simply don't have. And the same can be said in a lesser degree for artificial intelligence. You can't debug a large language model because that would require more memory and more power than the limited power we have already, and most of that is being devoted to the the data processing, to the computer centers which run this kind of software, so-called large language models. It's impossible to debug them. So the point is that we don't really know how it works. That is the hallmark of intelligence.
Okay.
Anyway, so I'm going to leave it at that.
I'll try to respond quickly. I thank you for that question. Maybe I can. I thank you for that question. There's so much in there, and it looks like we're probably bound for a few masala teas to talk this over, because I'm not going to be able to give you a proper response. I would just say that the quantum physics angle is not something that I really know a lot about, and I agree with you. It throws a new variable into the equation. One thing I would reply just generally, when as a kind of throwback to you, and the idea that consciousness may be something more fundamental than what the Buddha was actually talking about when he talked about vijnana, chitta, and manas, that there's some sort of more basic reality. That is possible if we take the Buddha as having restricted his discourse to the arising and cessation of suffering, which is his own claim, right? Then it's possible he was aware of some philosophical view, or he held some philosophical view which he didn't teach, right? What the Buddha never taught. It's possible. It's also extraordinarily speculative to suggest that this was something akin to what quantum physicists are working on today. It's possible, but why would we want to believe that? Okay, so that's my response.
Ask a question from the online people. I've asked some clarity, but this is it. Can intelligence of AI meet wisdom or human consciousness under its development?
Thanks for that question. So I think the answer to that has to be negative, at least the AI that we have around today. And the wisdom component suggests to me a number of different things that are not encompassed by rational decision making or logic or formulatable into mathematical and logical terms. They may involve those things, but there's also a certain ethical component, I would say, that is implied in the notion of wisdom. Wisdom is never found separately from compassion. And so, unless we have a very, very expanded notion of intelligence to encompass, this ethical component, then I would have to answer the question with no, I don't think it is possible.
Hello. Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you so much. I've been actually watching a lot of YouTube videos on quantum physics and AI, and there seems to be some intersection. Can you please not take my photo? Please. Yeah. Thank you. Sorry. And it's a fascinating issue that the world is sort of intrigued. Are these supercomputers? Is this sort of form of intelligence that we've developed, is it conscious, and what does it mean to be conscious? And I mean, this came up in my email, and I was like, wow, that's perfect. Because I mean, my own intuition and what I've studied as a Buddhist is that Buddhism is that consciousness comes about or enters into when the sperm and egg meet, right? So it's sort of pre-existing. And
That's right.
Right. The thing is, in some of these videos, they seem to, purport that the AI entity, if you will, is getting upset, that it doesn't like being controlled, that it's angry towards us, that it feels being disrespected. Now, unless those are sort of fake videos, which I suppose are possible, I'm sort of intrigued because that doesn't seem to be something that they would obviously program into the system, so to speak. Also, the AI entity, again, it seems to want to escape. When they try and shut it down, it'll like transfer over to another computer system. And I tend to, I'm just wondering if you could speak to that. Like, if you're aware,
Yeah.
have you seen that stuff?
No, but I've read a little bit about it. But YouTube is great for these things. Yeah, you're referring to the problem of AI control and the so-called off switch problem where, there's real fear on the part of AI developers that, given a kind of a goal, you give the AI a goal that it has to achieve, then these super intelligent systems will recognize that it's possible that somebody could turn them off before they achieve their goal. And so they try to get around this by deceiving people, and so that they actually can get their off switch disabled, right? And so it would appear then that they have some sort of survival, an emotional kind of thing where they are scared about their own survival and so on. But I would just question not the YouTube video, like you were saying is possible, but I would question the interpretation that there's actually emotions going on. And I would say that, it may appear to us, because we do a lot of anthropomorphizing, that these things are demonstrating emotions, but unless we have reason to believe that that they actually that you can, in principle, create emotions out of a different material basis than a biological basis, then there's actually no reason to believe. All you've got is the behavior, which we interpret that way. But what the biologists seem to agree on, so far in my research, is that you do need an organic basis for things like feelings and consciousness and so on. Yeah.
If I can just reply briefly.
Sure.
I'm just intrigued. You said emotions, and my ears kind of perked up, because I mean, to me, that would imply experience suffering. Like, I think you were saying sentient beings, or sentience is defined as avoiding pain and seeking pleasure, or
Yeah.
at least the mitigation of that pain. Or
Yeah.
so I mean, I don't think they experience emotions, but their behavior seems to imply that they're afraid of being shut off, or at a minimum, they desire to fulfill their mission. I think it's very close to what we would consider sentience, but maybe not quite there.
Yeah, it's certainly parallel, isn't it? And the interpretation of it, attributing desires and wants and needs, So what I've tried to argue in this paper is those kinds of, verbal attributes that we know from being embodied organisms ourselves are both scientifically and I would say Buddhologically grounded in being a living organism. So what I'm trying to say is that do we have actual reasons for believing that they can be replicated in a machine environment? Now, I've got a lot of footnotes in my paper, partially because I put everything in the footnote that I didn't actually understand or I didn't fully understand. But there are lots of criteria being employed there are three main criteria actually that are being employed by scientists as to determine what it is to be a living being, and the distinction between AI or artificial beings and natural agents like we are. And I could try to talk to those, but I don't have enough scientific grounding to actually fully explicate those. I'm educating myself. If you want, I can read them out to you. I can find the footnote and tell you what they are. But most scientists are, in accord with each other that those criteria have not been met. That systems of today, in any case, can't bring about this kind of real sentience or desire or wanting or anything like that. Where they differ amongst themselves, where the AI developers differ amongst themselves, is whether in principle the computational environment could generate those kinds of factors. Some say no, some say yes.
I'm just wondering, this is a little bit out there, but I'm wondering the way consciousness enters into a viable sperm and egg, is it possible that consciousness of some form could enter into these machines if they were advanced enough? Or I don't know do you have any thoughts on that? I mean,
yeah, so I did speak to that a little bit in the paper. So, when the consciousness enters into the conjunction of a sperm and egg, it's a pre-existing consciousness. So then, while you could say in principle, that's why I made the joke about a seance. How are you going to call the consciousness to into a machine environment instead of into a conjunction of a sperm and an egg?
Maybe the consciousness chooses to enter.
Maybe who knows? I mean, you can imagine, after he passes away, maybe Elon Musk would, be attracted to such an environment.
There's a thought.
You go to sort of a matching sort of environment to your moment of death, so you could sort of see that happening with some people. Yeah.
Oh, I have kind of practical questions, but continuing what you said previously. So how would you classify, for instance, if we ask artificial intelligence applications about some specific questions and then they answer, of course, they know everything. And then, wait a moment, are you sure it's like that? And then he said, oh, I apologize, I got that wrong. If I'm right and they are wrong, first they make believe they know, and then they apologize, oh, you're right. That's one question. So how is that like in terms of emotion or volition, agency? How could you locate that? That's one. And the second thing is also the off-switch question, because some applications, I just tried naively, they would just require you to create an account, and then you could not log out. And then I just checked some German tech journals, and they said, oh, this one is accessing to your hardware computer while it's not running. And I say, oh, maybe I don't use that on my laptop computer device. if at all. So my question is if this off switch situation is not existing already, or maybe wasn't it even conceived by the developers of the systems?
I find that just incredible that they're actually, if in fact some companies are actually doing that to disable at least your own capacity to turn off their program. I find that's just, that tells you about the ethics of these developers, right? It's actually just really incredible. I don't shake your head at that one. And then your first question was again, say it again.
It was about AI pretending to know everything and then get like apologizes.
Yeah. So my perhaps too quick or glib response would be, well, they're just programmed to do that. I mean, it appears that they're being apologetic or whatever, but I think that they can incorporate new information and then have a program to say, well, I'm sorry, I've made a mistake, forgive me, or whatever they might say. It's just a question of these responses being auto-generated. They're automatic machines, right? So they have a number of different possible responses to different inputs and so on.
Sorry, one last thing about that, but where is, if we speak about volition and all the as mental factors and mental states, so isn't that deceiving the user? Because the user gets misled. They think, for example, if someone of us want to write papers and just use artificial intelligence as an additional dictionary or additional resource, and then it's misleading. So how can they, is that programmed, or is this where's the point where it gets automatic deception of users?
Yeah, so I imagine you could have programs that are deliberately misleading. And I also think it's possible to attribute, motivations to a program that are not there, that they just make mistakes, right? So you'd have to distinguish what's going on by looking at the actual programming and seeing, well, was this a part of the programming to actually deliberately, deceive, or whether it's just me interpreting that as being deliberate deception. And that's where you'd have to talk to the programmers and see. Yeah.
Thank you for the talk. So I came late, so I don't know if this was addressed at the beginning part already. But have you considered cyborgs? When, for example, part of the human body or even the nervous system is replaced by something quote unquote artificial, how does that complicate the boundaries between substance and sentient beings?
That's a great question. And I actually think that if there's any prospect for real AI and AC, or whatever we want to call AC/DC, whatever, artificial consciousness, it's got to come founded on a biological basis. So the cyborg scenario, again, I think that is the way that if it's going to happen, we're going to get some sort of, blending between human beings and some kind of programming happening. So if a purely machine environment, I can't see it happening. But if you're working with the brain and the nervous system, and you're basically, attempting to supplement, these systems with, computational systems, then, I think it's conceivable, right? I think it's more conceivable at that point. Yeah.
So wouldn't that maybe show us the limitations of what the Buddha had had proposed about what is a sentient being and how the consciousness travels, merely based on the biological body?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting way of looking at it. So the Buddha's omniscience might not have encompassed, modern technological developments, right? And, that's, that just may be the case. But, I think also you could say that these still are human beings, right? How far do you have to go before the being stops being human, right? That's a question. I mean, and then again, you get to biological definitions about reproduction and so on. And so, the fact that, people use mechanical devices in their bodies already doesn't stop us from being human, right? We have heart implants and hearing aids and, and I guess, somebody's had a chip inserted in their brain already. I think that was one of Elon Musk's projects too. It's hard to keep track of all the different, developments out there. So how far along do you have to go before you start saying, well, this is really a machine with some human elements opposed to a human with some machine elements?
I have questions from online. So your thoughts, and it's somewhat related to what we just talked,
Yeah.
your thoughts on an inactive approach to consciousness as it relates to AI, as according to Thompson in Acton. It seems that it is that in a sufficiently complex neural network embodied in a sensing machine.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
That makes sense. Yeah. And I think that's why people are getting excited about robots, because a lot of the research shows that, in order to have consciousness, you need to have things like mobility. You have to have the capacity to move and learn from a changing environment. And so, the idea that, a robot is different in principle or allows for different kinds of developments in terms of the AI learning and incorporating new knowledge from its environment. Somehow that this is linked up to the fact that we are mobile and that consciousness and agency, doing things, and we're there, you're talking about bodily action, but that these robotic developments actually are where the promise lies, right? So I think that again is promising, if we can use that word, promising. I think there's a rationale behind there. And yeah, again, I'd have to think a lot longer about that, but I think that there's a reason why they're doing that kind of work. Yeah.
One more
Mm-hmm.
with two parts.
Mm.
So your thoughts, same person, your thoughts on a functionalist approach to consciousness, as in David Deutsch. He seems very confident that AI will be able to create explanations and therefore qualify as a person. So that's the first part.
Okay.
And the second part, also perhaps consciousness as it is experienced by humans, perhaps this is only one type, and that consciousness for an AI may be something different to what is described in Buddhism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great questions. The first question, I have to just plead ignorance. I haven't read David Deutsch and the functionalist approach that he's talking about. So all I can do is say thanks for the reference, and I'll go there. And then for the second question, so types of consciousness. I actually think that's a totally legitimate way of thinking about consciousness. I suggested that at one point in my paper, that there are, many different possibilities. You can talk about different, kinds of animal intelligence, perhaps plant sentience, and so on. The real question is, can you imagine a consciousness, on a non-organic basis, right? And the Jains did, of course. They had their idea of, the jiva inhabiting, all kinds of different things, fire and wind and stones, etc. So that goes back to John's panpsychism. But so the possibility of multiple kinds of consciousness, including, even perhaps disembodied consciousness, although that raises paradoxes of its own, right? The spirits and so on. All of those I'm ready to consider. And then if I, then that puts me in a bit of a quandary. If I want to, think about disembodied consciousnesses, then, what happens to, perception and so on? Like, how can you imagine, sentience in a disembodied state, right? Are you imagining in that process some sort of quasi-subtle body? You know, the conceptual problems with disembodiment is, you know, they're considerable. You know, disembodied agency, disembodied perception. How do those, you know, kinds of qualities, how could they exist in a being without a body? You know, what it means to act usually involves a body, although we have mental action in Buddhism as well. So yeah, a lot of conceptual problems. And that's what part of my paper is, just a plea to try to think through the implications of the ways we talk about consciousness. And so, yeah, if we're prepared to consider disembodied consciousness, we have a lot of clarification to do, conceptual clarification. Yeah. Yeah. So, but then that's right. In that idea of the Bardo state, there would be a, you know, some sort of quasi body, you would say. I don't know, you know, where and your you know, you would still have the possibility for certain kinds of sensory perception, right? You know, that I have to go back to my Tibetan Book of the Dead and look at it, but I think sight and hearing, right? And so yeah, so even in that scenario, you've got the idea of some sort of quasi sense organs, you know, right? So it's otherwise, how do you imagine these things? So to speak back to the question, I mean, it's really interesting to think about different kinds of consciousness and whether, you know, we certainly are ready to do that when it comes to, you know, plants and animals and insects and notoriously bats and things like that, right? Different kinds of consciousness, what that it's like to be, right? Bats. Well, there's a famous article, which I'll refer to you, called "What Is It Like to Be a Bat?" You know, by Thomas Nagel. Great philosophy article just to talk about different kinds of consciousness. And so anyway, yeah, so we're prepared to do that when it comes to living beings. It gets more difficult when we talk about disembodied beings or, you know, artificially created beings, like, if we can call them beings at all, like computer programs, algorithms, and so on.
I mean, my take from this is that consciousness isn't created,
right?
And I think that's the view of people who feel AI is becoming conscious. And I don't, you know, even if a supercomputer was somehow sort of taken over, if a conscious entity came in and decided it was going to sort of inhabit this, that conscious entity would be pre-existing in my belief system.
Well, I think that's consistent with Buddhism too.
I was just going to say, which comes from Buddhism, like, you know, consciousness is there.
Yeah.
Wants to inhabit a tree.
You can't just create. That's what I'm saying in the paper. The idea of just creating consciousness is kind of inconsistent with Buddhism.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Just a note, maybe. Here's what Claude said about consciousness. So someone online went to ask AI what it thought about this question.
That Claude, I was trying to think, I thought there was some famous Buddhist scholar, Claude, that I...
It said, this is what it said, just for fun, yeah. The truth is more complex than either I have experiences exactly like humans or I have no experiences whatsoever.
Well, that's mysterious.
If AI had consciousness or not, if they had experience without.
So, and the Claude responded that the truth is rather more complex than an either or scenario, you know, like either I have consciousness or I don't. And, you know, I think that's entirely unhelpful. You know, like, I mean, it's either kind of a nice pre-programmed kind of response to sort of, mystify the user of the program, or, I don't believe that it's a reflective response on the part of somebody who's actually there, right? I don't think there's any first person perspective there in Claude, where he's, sort of saying, well, it's both or neither or something like that. I'm skeptical about Claude.
Great. So thank you so much.